Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Your Legislators, a production of KRWG Broadcasting. Your Legislators is a public service program providing our viewing audience in southern New Mexico the opportunity to hear about important legislative issues directly from their elected representatives in Santa Fe. Here's your host, Sloan Patton.
Thanks for being with us. On our show today, Dr. Terry McMillan. He's the Republican representative for District 37, and he's an ear, nose, and throat doctor in Las Cruces. He was reelected in an extremely tight race. Thanks for being with us today, Dr. McMillan.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Definitely. Well, so I just want to start off by asking what legislation you're working on.
Well, it depends what you mean. I have several pieces of legislation that I'm planning to introduce, but of course we're all working on a large body of legislation, some of which may be more important to the constituents than what I might be personally sponsoring. I do have a piece of legislation I'll mention that I think is particularly pertinent to my constituents, and that is a piece of legislation that comes in response to the fact that we had a small child killed by a dog in my district this past year. I've brought legislation that would allow, in some cases, for owners to be held criminally responsible if their dogs perpetrate injuries, especially in the case where the owner had prior knowledge that the dog might be prone to such attacks. Legislation along these lines has been pursued inappropriately, I think, by trying to restrict owners' access to certain breeds of dogs. I oppose that type of approach and that type of legislation. We are a dog-loving culture. All my constituents have dogs. My family has always had dogs. And the numbers of dogs have just simply grown, and we're going to have to grow into owner responsibility for the behaviors of their dogs. I have had constituents complain that they don't feel perfectly safe when they walk the streets and neighborhoods of my district or go to the park with their children. So this is an interesting piece of legislation. It may take significant work to craft and get passed, but I think it's of particular interest to my constituents. I have about 3 or 4 pieces of medically related legislation which is designed to protect my constituents as consumers of health care. In particular, I'm bringing legislation that would alter how we credential physicians in the community. We've had some recent incidences around the state where poorly qualified physicians have harmed some patients, and I'm going to attempt to tighten the means by which they're credentialed. In addition, we are going to try to bring legislation that would alter how we make the decision in the legislature as to who will do what in health care. Who's most qualified, who has the best training. We have a political process for making those decisions, and I'd like to make it more factual. So I'm also bringing legislation along those lines. I've recently introduced legislation that will provide funding for nurses who are currently working in our hospitals to access higher education. One of the reasons our local nursing program at the branch failed is because of a similar problem around the state of a lack of properly qualified instructors. The fund that we're going to create would allow access to promote education of nurses that are currently working for hospitals, that is, working in the private sector. This, I hope, will allow us to provide more nurses with master's and PhD degrees to teach our nurses, as we see an impending huge shortage of nurses.
And since you're a doctor, I would love to touch on a few medical issues here in the city and in the county. Medical costs for people, a lot of times insurance will pay 100% for medical supplies or drugs that are used, but then doctors and nurses are not fully compensated. Is there anything that we can do in the state legislature to change that, or the AMA? Is there anything that can be done on that issue?
You know, that's a huge question. the costs of accessing health care continue to escalate to the point that many of our citizens are unable to pay for a product that would provide adequately for themselves and their families. This is the driving force behind creating government-sponsored programs. Certainly, if Obamacare comes to fruition and actualizes, the promise is that patients up to 4 times the poverty level will be able to get some help from the federal government with making those premium payments. Why is it getting more expensive is an excellent question, and it's a very complex one. Let me say, first of all, that medical treatments, medical technology and diagnostics are very technologically complex. The technologies that we bring to bear in healthcare to extend people's lives and their quality of lives are expensive. On top of that, rendering healthcare is a hands-on project. It'll never be mechanized. Our patients won't tolerate that. There's an ever-expanding number of treatments for an ever-expanding number of diagnoses. So the cost of healthcare and providing healthcare has expanded dramatically and will continue to do so as we offer treatments that actually make the difference between life and death. And those treatments are not inexpensive. It's a difficult problem, and it's one of the problems of this century in how we'll solve and master and harness medicine and make it available to as many people as we can.
An issue that is maybe more pertinent to some of the areas outside of Doña Ana County on the outlying parts of the city and county is that there is a lack of doctors that are qualified in some parts of the region. And I've heard a lot of people mention the idea of using nurse practitioners or other people to take on some of those positions that were previously done by doctors. Do you think that's a good idea?
Well, that's an excellent question. It's a very good question. And look, we've been in this process for 10 or 15 years. Nurse practitioners are providing a very large percentage of the primary care in New Mexico now.
Right.
As an ear, nose, and throat doctor, most of my referrals are now coming from nurse practitioners and physician assistants. It is absolutely, I think, necessary in our environment to have the debate about how we can get the care out there to as many people as we can, while at the same time not exposing them to the risks that are inherent to providers that are not adequately trained. This is a debate that goes on in our legislature constantly. I think that there are definitely roles that mid-levels can provide safely and efficiently, and we're in the process of making that transition. It's a necessary thing for us, but we have to be very careful about those areas in which we allow mid-levels to practice beyond the level of their training.
And turning now to the governor's State of the State, what stood out to you when you were listening to Governor Martinez speak?
Pardon me. I think her message gets behind what's the real critical circumstance for New Mexico today. New Mexico has been and remains very dependent on federal government programs and employment. I think everyone may be aware out there that Forbes magazine recently published an article of a ranking of the 50 states based upon their susceptibility to major cutbacks by the federal government. And New Mexico ranked #1. New Mexico ranks #1 on the list of the 50 states that will be hit when the inevitable federal cutbacks come. We know those are coming. We all know that the federal government is deficit spending, that our debt continues to accumulate. The political will is not present to address this problem, which is a bipartisan problem. We cannot forever go on without paying our bills. When that difficult time comes, New Mexico is going to be in a very difficult position because our private economy is just not that large. I think the governor's State of the State address goes along with many of us as legislators who are concerned that we have this one opportunity the next few years to try to stimulate and grow a real private economy in New Mexico. And many of her items of her agenda are with that intention in mind.
Mm-hmm. And in the immediate, we here in the state seem to have a much different position than the federal government. We have a surplus in our budget. Do you see that changing in the immediate future if a lot of federal funds are cut?
Well, our funds as a state come from different sources, of course, than the federal government. It is impossible to predict how our own state budget will do over the next few years.
That's true.
I'm sure you're aware that much of our budget is supplied by taxation and revenues that we garner from the oil and gas industry. It's been very good times for the oil industry in the last couple of years, and so we've had a surplus. So we are advantaged in New Mexico, as many states are, by this, and I would point to this. We're required to balance our budget. We do that every year, and we do it in a way that balances our taxation level with the expenditures that we lay out, and we keep anywhere from 7 to 9 or even 10% in savings. We do that responsibly in our state because we're required to do so. The problem at the federal government level is that they have no requirement whatsoever to balance their budget, and this is quite honestly a flaw in our Constitution. By all means, let's have the debate about taxes and spending, but let's live within our budget. In New Mexico, we're able to do that. Pardon me.
Mm-hmm. And another topic that Governor Martinez talked about during her State of the State, she really focused in on driver license laws for illegal immigrants. And I've been stopping myself because the governor is a Republican, but she supports driver licenses for illegal immigrants. Do you align with her on that, or do you have different views?
Well, I think you have that backwards. The governor, part of one of the platforms she ran on was to discontinue the process of giving driver's licenses to non-New Mexicans. And we have fought this battle for 2 sessions, and of course she's very determined to discontinue this practice. She feels, along with many others, that it jeopardizes our security. Several alternatives have been proposed, and this battle has not been joined yet in this legislature. I support discontinuing this process. I also support a remedy for those who are here working and are not here legally. We know that they're a long time part of our economy and part of our culture. I would submit that we should not give them driver's licenses, but that we can consider giving them some alternative form of identification that gives them permission to drive. Our law enforcement are the ones that principally want us to have some type of identification. Issuing them a permit to drive will allow us to require that they purchase insurance, but it will not allow them to be confused with New Mexicans. So that's the way I think we should head with this issue.
Mm-hmm. Are there any specific bills you hope to pass related to it?
I'm not myself sponsoring any bills related to the driver's license issue, but there are several of them out there, as there are every session. Mm-hmm. There are bills that would simply discontinue the process of issuing the driver's licenses, and nothing more. Those bills are going to be debated and possibly amended as we go through the legislative process. There's also a bill that I hear rumored that may start on the Senate side that would not only discontinue the process, but would provide for a remedy to the situation. That is, it would discontinue the process of giving driver's licenses to non-New Mexicans, but would institute the process of giving a permit, a type of identification that cannot be confused with a driver's license. I think that in the end is what we're going to wind up heading to by the end of the session.
Right. Yeah, that sounds like more of a compromise that perhaps we could see some Democrats vote for as well. We'll certainly keep an eye on. Right, we'll keep an eye on that one. On gun control, it's of course been a huge national issue after what happened in Connecticut and some of the recent events at a high school in Albuquerque. Well, on gun control, are there is there any legislation that you could support?
Not so far. As a matter of fact, I want to apologize before I go further. I'm recovering from a cold, and if I'm sniveling and my voice is hoarse, I apologize for that, but we will persevere. We heard a bill in Judiciary Committee just night before last, which was a proposal that would have required background checks for all private gun transactions. It would have, in addition, closed the loop that allows gun transactions at gun shows, some of them, to go without a background check. In debating, we debated this bill in the Judiciary Committee for 5 or 6 hours the other night and heard public input from both sides. In the end, we tabled that bill, and I voted to table that bill because it's massively flawed. It would have allowed a whole lot of very difficult and unanticipated circumstances to arise. People would have been able to do background checks on other people when there's actually no gun being sold or transferred. There were major flaws with that piece of legislation, and many of us were able to see that. No obvious remedies were offered, and so that piece of legislation was tabled. It may be the case that the legislation will be properly amended and we'll have more opportunity to debate it.
Sure. What do you think, in your opinion, makes the economy grow in New Mexico?
The economy growing in New Mexico, I don't think would be different than the economy growing in any other location. There are a couple of things, obviously, that keep our economy from growing in a robust fashion, like some of the states that are around us. We don't really have an inviting regulatory and tax environment for large employers. We have an ideal and wonderful environment and climate. People and companies, corporations are attracted to that. But there's many aspects of our tax environment that cause them to choose other states to locate. Our regulatory environment also is similar. There are certain changes that we need to make it more inviting while continuing to be able to generate revenues to provide the services. In addition, one of the major flaws is we need significant educational improvement in terms of providing the type of workers that are trained and ready to go in some of the technology-heavy corporations, companies, and interests that would like to locate here. We have a serious shortage of people that are ready to go to work right now. And so some of the things that we can do would be to provide those resources to companies that would like to locate here but have a workforce ready to go.
Mm-hmm. And now, I don't want to make a fight that's not really going on. You know, sometimes we hear about the North versus the South in New Mexico, but just since you've been in Santa Fe for a few years now, what do you think northern New Mexico's biggest misconceptions are about southern New Mexico's, at least just as far as the legislature goes?
That's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about that. One of the things that's true about the legislature, in the recent past, at least in the last 10 to 20 years, is that for the most part, and until very recently, it's been dominated by Northern Democrats. Pardon me, our past speaker was a Northern Democrat. And being a legislator from the South, it's been easy to feel that we're isolated and that our interests are not adequately represented. I don't think that Northern legislators have any misconception about the southern part of the state. We're a booming and economically growing and happening part of the state. I think that they have an accurate appraisal of legislators and of southern New Mexico in general. Recently, we of course have made inroads. Our Senate Speaker Pro Tem is now a legislator from Doña Ana County, Mary Kay Papin. Our governor is from Las Cruces, and these things are very important at making sure having legislators from southern New Mexico are in leadership positions is very important to having our voice heard, and so I think we're going to be more of a player, so to speak, going forward.
Right. And here in southern New Mexico, we of course have the Spaceport that's being worked on. Do you support informed consent legislation? How important is it to pass that legislation?
I appreciate that question, and that was number one thing on my agenda coming to Santa Fe, was to do everything I could to ensure that we get informed consent for our businesses that want to locate at the Spaceport. Basically, all this legislation does is raise the bar a little bit in terms of what circumstances in which a passenger might sue the various interests that put them in space. It simply raises the bar. It will never prohibit lawsuits being brought when there's negligence on the part of these businesses. But we were under a significant pressure in that competitive spaceports had already provided these protections. And some of our potential tenants at the spaceport had threatened to not come. And I had bad dreams about our spaceport growing tumbleweeds. I mean, literally. I'm happy to report that, and I'm sure most Las Crucens know by this time, but Virgin Galactic and the Trial Attorneys Association came to an agreement actually behind the scenes, and we now have compromise legislation that both sides have come to the table on and that we believe is going to get through the legislature in a very rapid fashion. So that's a great thing. Our spaceport looks like it's going to happen. As soon as the ink is dry on that legislation, Virgin Galactic is going to bring somewhere upwards of 100 to 120 families to Las Cruces to start working full-time to make this begin to happen.
Yeah. Why do you think it was such a long time coming to get some legislation that both sides agreed on?
I can't say. Honestly, I wasn't party to what went on. I think it's certainly the fact that we were not, it took so long to get this legislation done is a reflection of how powerful the trial attorney's lobby is. Once the two parties apparently sat down to discuss their differences, they found they weren't that far apart. And I think fairly quickly thereafter we're able to come to terms that were agreeable to both.
Mm-hmm. And so going back to the issue of education, I know you mentioned that you hope to have especially more people trained as nurse practitioners in this area. What do you think that we can do from elementary school, middle school, high school, at that level? What can we do to change education?
We're already doing it. There are several ways that we can try to provide young people with skills that will get them good work with benefits. And many of those things are already in place. But let me point principally to that innovation which is exclusive to Las Cruces that was put together by The Bridge, which is a coalition between our business community and our public education, and culminated in what we call the Early College High School. Early College High School has been a smashing success and offers our students a fast track in training to a very viable degree. Dual credit is offered, and as you may be aware, it's in its third or fourth year now, and there has yet to be a single dropout from that program. I believe, and Governor Martinez is promoting the expansion of this program around the state. But I can proudly say that we pioneered in Las Cruces this project, Early College High School, which is going to be, I believe, a major force in providing our young people with the skills that they need, and they need to offer companies that would like to locate in New Mexico.
Mm-hmm. And coming up on the last couple of minutes of the show, I'd like to talk about an issue that it can always take a little more than a couple of minutes, but our state to the north, Colorado, has legalized medical marijuana. Do you ever see New Mexico doing that, and would you support any legislation of that type?
No, we've already legalized medical marijuana. We've done that several years ago, and we have a fairly robust program that allows distribution, that allows distribution in appropriate circumstances to patients that would benefit from medical marijuana. I'm a supporter of that program and have been from the beginning. I think you may be alluding to the fact that Colorado passed recreational use of marijuana and allows access to marijuana for recreational use.
Right.
I don't know if this issue is going to come up in our session or not. There are rumors that it might. I would argue, and quite honestly, that marijuana is a less dangerous drug than several that we make quite legal, nicotine and alcohol, and we regulate and tax it.
Right.
As a physician, I want to make sure that I make a couple of points. The most dangerous drug that ever came on the planet and came into wide and extensive use, of course, is nicotine. This has killed and maimed more patients on the planet and more people on the planet than any other drug. The second most dangerous drug may indeed be alcohol in terms of mortality, morbidity, damage to the culture. The issue of whether or not to legalize marijuana is a complex one. I would not oppose legalization, regulation, and taxation of marijuana if it came from the federal level, because it's a very complex issue. It's going to require a significant regulation. We've got a lot of decisions to make about how much marijuana you can legally intake and still drive or still perform functions. I would probably oppose it on the state level. If I were a federal legislator and this legislation came up, I don't think I would oppose it strongly.
All right. Well, Dr. McMillan, thanks so much for being on the show with us today.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for being patient with me as I recover from this cold. I'm doing better, and things are beginning to crank up. It's about to get very busy.
Definitely, yeah. I guess you've just been shaking too many hands up there. That's probably why you got sick.
Well, everybody goes through a cold while they're here during the 2-month-long session. It's just a fact of life of serving as a legislator.
I'm sure. And thank all of you for watching. I'm Sloan Patton. We'll see you next week.